Okay, well, stand by just in case. So welcome everybody. Sorry about all the teething problems, but that's how it goes. It's kind of weird talking to a virtual large audience. So now I've just got a message that says your internet connection is unstable, which is just the joys of life. Okay, so Pitcairn, or as the islanders call it, Pitcairn, that's the Pitcairn-centered view of the world. So it really is in the middle of nowhere. So that's where Pitcairn sits, in the middle of the South Pacific. I'm so used to saying South Atlantic. And it's kind of more or less 2/3 of the way from Tahiti to Easter Island. So it's right at the eastern extent of the French Polynesian islands. And it's a group of 4 islands that are part of the UK. They're a UK overseas territory. And you can see there, relative to the UK itself, they're really quite far-flung islands, and as a result have a very large exclusive economic zone around them. So that orange sort of funny-shaped lozenge around the islands is the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And it says there, proposed Pitcairn Islands Marine Reserve, but this is a dated figure. So the entire waters around the islands have been declared a marine protected area, and it's a no-take marine reserve. So it's the 7th largest marine protected area in the world and the 3rd largest no-take MPA. So the islanders are allowed to catch for local consumption, but there's no commercial exploitation of resources. So it really is an amazing part of the world. And this is a rather complicated figure that shows the relative degree of pristineness, if you like, of different marine areas around the world. And you can see that Pitcairn is in the bottom left, which is the best place to be. So the 2 axes are telling you different things about impact, but basically Pitcairn is one of the least impacted areas on the planet from a marine impact perspective. The one problem that there is there, or the one thing that's been highlighted, is a lot of junk washing ashore. And this is the east side of Henderson Island, and there was a paper that came out in 2017 suggesting that this is one of the most polluted beaches in the world. So that was my proximate reason for going to visit the islands, other than the fact that I've always wanted to go there. But having worked on plastic for some time in the ocean, I've kind of used that as an excuse to talk my way into getting there. And my immediate contact who got me there was Andy Schofield, who is the RSPB officer in charge of all of the overseas territories, which is a very far-flung and widespread purview. So he's responsible for places like Tristan and St. Helena, various islands in the Caribbean, Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and Pitcairn in the Pacific. So not surprisingly, they very seldom see Andy at the lodge in Cambridge because he's often out and about. And this is Andy on Pitcairn, leaving the prison. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And I've been sort of nagging Andy for some years now to say, you know, next time you go to Pitcairn, is there any chance I can come along? And he was in Cape Town last year and he said, well, I'm actually going and I'm leading a group there. And if you want, I can try to sneak you on. And this was the initial offering of the so-called Pitcairn Explorers Voyage. So the UK government, in an attempt to grow the economy of Pitcairn, has started running tourist visits to the island. And traditionally people just go to the main island of Pitcairn, but this was the first attempt to try to take tourists to all 3 other islands as well. And this was our rather interesting group of people. We had a retired medical couple from the US. We had a random German lady who just really enjoyed the South Pacific. And then we had the 3 guys in the foreground there were serious world listers. All 3 of them had been to Pitcairn twice before, but hadn't managed to get to the other islands in the group. And their goal was to get ashore on all 4 of the Pitcairn Islands. So it was an interesting experience. To get to Pitcairn is half of the adventure. You have to, the easiest way, I guess, is to fly to Tahiti. So that's what I did, not without some misadventure along the way, but after about 36 hours of flying, finally arrived in Tahiti, had a day and a half or so to recuperate in the glorious surroundings of French Polynesia. Took in a few of the local sites, lots of introduced birds and a few native ones, quite spectacular scenery. This is all on the main island of Tahiti, and some interesting wildlife, some rather strange eels that occurred right in the middles of town in some of the gutters and things. And I had to go pay homage to the big wave site on Tahiti, which was actually working the day that I went down there. It was quite impressive to see, quite a crazy wave. But from Tahiti, it's still a long way to Pitcairn, and the best thing to do is to fly to Mangareva, which is about a 2.5 to 3 hour flight within French Polynesia, and it just brings home to you the expanse of ocean. You know, you just fly for hour after hour and there's just blue water underneath, and occasionally you see a little atoll like this in the distance. And eventually we came into land at Mangareva, which is a classic sort of fringing atoll, but with high islands in the middle. Quite famous for its pearls, and obviously a French colony, so lots of French connections, French vehicles, interesting sort of place, lots of fruit everywhere, lychees and pawpaws, and encouragingly some awareness of the problems of invasive species on islands. So looking at controlling rodents and ants on some of the outlying islands where they still have significant populations of things like Polynesian storm petrels, and even community notices around things like plastics and the problems that they bring. They have a big problem with the African land snail as well. So everywhere you go, you see African land snails crushed all over the place. And then from Mangareva, it was aboard the Silver Server, which is the ship that the UK government has contracted for 3 years to support logistics and take people and equipment and food to and from Pitcairn. And it's about a 1.5 day steam, so it's not a huge distance from Mangareva, but it's just enough to whet your appetite, start getting into some of the birding, start seeing lots of great frigate birds. Not huge numbers of sooty terns, but certainly the odd sooty tern. But the commonest bird by far is Murphy's petrel, which was a new bird for me and one that I've looked for off California without success. So it was great to finally catch up with Murphy's petrel. And then after a 1.5 days, we arrived at Pitcairn. And it's really quite a small island. It's the only high island in the group, and that's why it's the only one that's inhabited, because the elevation means that it gets more rainfall than the low-lying atolls. So this is a Google Earth image. You can see it's a couple of kilometers long by about 1.5 kilometers wide. So it's not a huge place, and you can see there all the houses clustered on the northern shore of the island. This is what it looks like from the sea on a nice day. There's no real harbor like Tristan. It's got a small boat harbor where they pull the boats out of the water. This is the landing place, the main landing place, and you can see the slipway where they haul the longboats out of the water. On this day, actually, when we were leaving, there were 2 vessels there, the Silver Server and another vessel that was bringing off a group of radio hams. The day we arrived, it looked a lot more like this. It was pretty rough and miserable, and I was really impressed that we actually went ashore. It was quite scary. By Tristan standards, there was no ways we would have gone ashore on a day like this. It was really quite marginal. There is another landing site on the western side of the island, so if it's unlandable at the main landing, you can land at Tedside, but it's also not the greatest sort of place. You can see the water here washing over the quayside. And it's just a view from up above the landing site on a beautiful day looking out across the South Pacific. And of course, Pitcairn is most famous for being colonized, as it were, by the mutineers on the Bounty. In fact, the Polynesians lived there for several hundred years before the Bounty mutineers arrived, but then died out. And so when the Bounty mutineers arrived, they found the island uninhabited. And this is the sort of commemorative plaques above the landing place, commemorating the 200-year centenary of the arrival of the mutineers in 1790. And when I first saw this plaque, I couldn't quite work out what was going on, because the one on the left has got sort of 8 names or 9 names, and the one on the right's got sort of all these strange 18 names. And it turns out that when they celebrated the 200-year anniversary, they only listed the mutineers and not the 18 Tahitians who accompanied them on their exile to Pitcairn. And obviously the history is quite central in the island. So in the town square, here's the anchor from the Bounty. But you know, it's just a very small, isolated island community. I've spent a lot of time on Tristan, where there's about 300 people. This is an order of magnitude less. It's less than 50 people now resident on the island, and not all of those are always there. So, you know, in terms of real Pitcairn people, it's getting down towards 30 or so people. So it's a really very small community. It does have a rather checkered history in recent times. This is the jail from the trials that happened around 20 years ago, when a whole bunch of nasty things happened on the island, and I'll leave you to read up about that if you want to pursue it. But it's now been turned into a sort of a craft shop and various other things, and so making something good out of what was a rather bleak phase in the history of the island. I was quite impressed with the solid waste management on the island. They've got a nice recycling depot, so they sort all of their waste, and the plan is to use some of this recycled material to upgrade tracks around the island. And they're very keen on tourism, despite the degree of isolation, and it's really nicely set out for self-guided tours. So people go there and spend maybe a week staying in a homestay, and they can explore. There's signs like this around the island telling you where you are, what you can see, where you can go. And there's a whole network of these little 4x4 quad bike tracks that you can walk around on the island. Lots of nice birdies to see, well, not lots, but certainly some nice birds to see, the white terns or fairy terns. Very pretty. Nice and photogenic, and 2 other species of noddies, the black noddy and grey noddy. And the island is, as I say, relatively small. It takes only in a day or so you can walk most of the island. This is the high point, where you've got the classic where to from here kind of signs. Not all of them strictly accurate. The distance to the South Pole is way out, but it gives you some idea of how far away you are from everywhere else. So it's not the most remote island in the world by any means, but in terms of distance from the nearest continent, it is one of the most remote islands. There's a whole interesting flora that you can get into. Unfortunately, a lot of the endemic plants are threatened by introduced species. And there's only one land bird on the island. It's the Pitcairn reed warbler, and the adults in particular have a high level of leucism, so you see a lot of birds that flash white like this. Interestingly, this Acrocephalus genus has radiated throughout the South Pacific. Most of the islands that haven't been too heavily impacted by humans have their own endemic reed warbler population, which is quite fun. But it's not just birds that you can see. There's all sorts of interesting things like these coconut crabs, which are really quite impressive specimens. If you're not careful where you put your feet, you might stand on one. Tend to come out after the rains. And again, encouraging was the awareness of invasive species. So there's quite a strong conservation ethos on the island. There's a conservation officer who's based on Pitcairn, and obviously trying to limit the impact of some of the invasive species, and signage around not transferring grass seeds from different parts of the island and so on. They do have quite a significant problem with invasive plants, so this is one of the introduced plant species that's taking over parts of the island, and you can see how it dominates and suppresses all of the native species from growing. Not too many introduced mammals. They did have a problem with introduced goats, then they managed to get rid of them all, and now they've allowed a few people to bring goats back onto the island, and unfortunately not all of those are being well penned, so this was a free-ranging goat again. So it's all very well removing invasive species, but you've got to make sure that you don't reintroduce them. This is St. Paul's Pool on the south end of the island, a spectacular rock pool, probably about 40 meters long. I was dying to swim in here, but unfortunately, by the time the sea calmed down enough, I'd managed to injure myself and wasn't allowed in the water, which was a bit frustrating. Not much in the way of beaches on the island. This is about the only really sandy beach, tiny little stretch of sandy beach on the west end of the island. But I spent as much time as I could wandering around the beaches looking for rubbish. Mostly what you find is lots of coconuts and then the occasional bottle. And I'll talk more about bottles in a bit. The best beach for rubbish is an east-facing beach because the prevailing weather comes from the east at this latitude. So this is called down rope because it's rather a steep descent. Ironically, there is no rope, so you take your life into your hands to go down there. And this is what it looks like down the bottom, really quite spectacular. This is where I saw my first bristle-thighed curlew, fairly common on the uninhabited islands, but not very common on Pitcairn. And this is where there's evidence of the early Polynesian settlers, some of their sort of pictographs engraved on the wall of the lava. So all these islands are volcanic, they've never been connected to mainland, and the fauna and flora that live there managed to disperse over 5,000 kilometers from the nearest continent. Because this is an east-facing beach, there's a lot more rubbish on this beach than any of the other beaches on Pitcairn, and the islanders have happily hung up all of the fishing floats. Very large proportion of the rubbish coming from offshore activities, fishing and shipping. From Pitcairn, after spending 3 or 4 days on Pitcairn, we went back onto the ship and we went off on our tour of the islands. And the first port of call was Henderson, which is by far the largest island in the Pitcairn group. It's a World Heritage Site. It's a raised atoll, so it was a typical, sort of fringing atoll with a central lagoon. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. I think there was a little bit of a delay on your screen. So if you just give which image are you showing? Is it the Google view of Henderson Island?
Yes.
Okay, good. We've caught up then. There was a little bit of a delay, and there's about a 5-second delay on your slide. So you might just either turn the slides a little bit
flick ahead,
or wait a little bit when you turn. Thanks. Sorry to
okay. No worries. So Henderson is by far the largest island. As I say, it's this raised atoll. From the sea, it doesn't look like much because even though it's raised, it's not raised much above sea level, maybe 10 meters at most. So it's this huge expanse of basically flat, old limestone coral. As you get closer, you can see the sea cliffs with sort of caves and marine erosion. So the whole atoll was uplifted through tectonic activity. And there are 3 beaches on the island, otherwise it's cliffs into the sea around the west. So a small beach on the western side, North Beach, which is the main landing beach, and then East Beach, which is the beach famous for all the rubbish on it. And unfortunately, the East Beach is the hardest one to get onto because it faces the weather. And the first day we arrived at Henderson, the only beach we could land on was the West Beach. So we went ashore. This just gives you some idea of, even though it was pretty flat, calm conditions, it's still an interesting landing because you're coming straight onto basically coral reef. And we were using these solid aluminium little boat to ferry people ashore. It would take 3 or 4 trips to get even a modest party of 10 or 12 people ashore. Just a scenic view of the western coast of Henderson to show you what it looks like on the ground, actually quite lovely. And you're met by mast boobies breeding along the shoreline. And if you try to venture into the vegetation, it's really very dense, and the understory is sort of crumbly old limestone and coral. So the footing is not at all easy. It's hot. There's things that bite, it's really not a terribly inviting place to go exploring too far away from the beach. Some interesting crabs. The hermit crabs climb up the trees. This one was probably about 5 or 6 foot above ground level. It's quite bizarre to see a hermit crab sitting in the top of a tree. For me, one of the more interesting plants was peperomia. It's a widespread genus in the Pacific, but there's a single population of peperomia on Inaccessible Island at Tristan, so it was nice to see a peperomia in its native habitat. And Henderson is the island with the most endemic birds. So there's 4 endemic birds on Henderson. There's the sort of more or less flightless crake, which looks a bit like a black crake. We've got a Henderson reed warbler, which is just like a Pitcairn reed warbler, but behaves somewhat differently. There's a rather pretty lorikeet, and then there's a fruit dove. And I was talking to John Matham this afternoon and had to admit that I didn't actually see the fruit dove because it's not particularly common, and I was too busy working. So the guys who stayed on the beach, stayed looking in the bush, after about 3 or 4 hours of searching, finally found a fruit dove, but I was busy running around picking up litter, so I didn't see a fruit dove. This is the signage that there is on the island. As I say, it's a World Heritage Site. The main landing on the North Beach, there's this signage to tell people what you can and can't do. So a lot of people just coming on yachts, not a lot, but you get the occasional yachty going past, they'll come ashore, and at least there's some information to tell them what the rules of engagement are. There's also this rather optimistic sign that says Henderson Island is now rat-free. This signage was put up when the rat eradication took place some years ago now, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I don't have it in my head. As part of a series of attempted rodent eradications throughout the Pacific, Henderson was visited by a boat with helicopter that flew and dropped poison bait all over the island. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed. We're still not 100% sure why all the rats didn't die, but they didn't. And that's very unfortunate for the birds that live on the island. So there's a petrel that's called the Henderson petrel, which mostly breeds on Henderson. There are small populations on other islands. We found them on Oeno and Ducie, and there's a small population in the Easter Island group as well. But the vast majority of them are thought to breed on Henderson Island, and they're not doing very well because their chicks get eaten by rats. So in the time that we were ashore on Henderson, we hardly saw a petrel, and you'll see when you get to the other islands the impacts of rats in terms of just the sheer numbers of birds on the other islands. So my main interest for getting to Henderson was to see this. This is the East Beach on Henderson, which is reputed to be one of the most polluted beaches in the world for plastic. It was cleaned in June 1990, and so I was particularly interested to see how much litter had come back. And unfortunately, they were unable to remove all the rubbish, so it's all still sitting there in caches, waiting for a plan to try to get it off the island. Interestingly, while we were steaming between the islands, we were recording all the litter we saw, and in almost 1,000 kilometers of transects, we only saw 19 litter items. So the density of litter at sea, even though there's this very dirty beach, is appreciably lower than it is, for example, around Tristan in the middle of the South Atlantic. So 10 times less floating litter around Pitcairn, which is interesting. And in fact, perhaps not too surprising, because the people who reported the very high densities on Henderson said it was because the island lay in the South Pacific Gyre. You've probably all heard of the North Pacific Gyre or the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Well, there are similar accumulations of floating plastic in all of the world's major ocean basins. And the story was that Henderson was close to the core of that. But in fact, the Pitcairn group lies to the west of the major accumulation zone. Easter Island is pretty much slap bang in the middle of it. And so we do see high levels of plastic around Easter Island. But the densities at sea around Pitcairn are not particularly high. From Henderson, we backtracked to Oeno. Our track was erratic because we were constrained by the weather. The two islanders who were guiding us locally, and the ship's crew were really amazing. They were just dead set on getting us to all of the islands. So from Henderson, we went back past Pitcairn to Oeno. Now, Oeno used to have rats, but was cleared around 20 years ago. It's a rather peculiar atoll in as much as it has the typical circular fringing reef, but instead of having a series of islands around the periphery, there's just one central island, which is about 1 kilometer or so long. And to me, this was the most spectacular island. We had the most beautiful day. Everything played ball. The fringing lagoon is just beautiful. It's really quite the most idyllic place. And just what a privilege to be able to walk along beaches like this. That's one of the tourists, an interesting Cockney, East London Cockney guy who's been everywhere in the world. Just amazing. You'd think he would struggle to get past the corner pub, but he's been absolutely everywhere. Quite bizarre. So this is what it looks like. You're busy strolling along, and then a Murphy's petrel flies past. During the day, there's just petrels flying around the whole time. It's incredible. Flying past your head. Under every bush, there's a Murphy's petrel chick, and scattered in amongst them, there's other species. This is a herald petrel, a pale morph herald, a dark morph herald. There's Kermadec petrels. There's all sorts of things. It's just incredible. Red-footed boobies nesting in the trees. Masked boobies nesting on the ground. Red-tailed tropic bird chicks snuggling under just about every bush. The occasional adult still sitting around, and yeah, just wonderful. Frigate birds soaring overhead. So that was Oeno, which was really great. And then we headed off to Ducie, which is the furthest east and most remote of the islands, the one that's most seldom visited. And this is more the classic atoll shape with a ring of motus around the edge of a central lagoon. Access is from the sort of southwest there through that rather shallow channel coming into that central lagoon. And again, from the sea, it doesn't look like much at all. Even if you zoom in a bit, it still doesn't look like much, very low lying. We were there on a grey, drizzly day. This is going through the channel to get into the central lagoon, basically walking the boat through because it was so shallow. Ideally, one would want a jet boat here. Couldn't use the outboard motor, even with a guard around the propeller because it was so shallow. And just a series of views. You can see the silver server in the background there, maybe just a little red dot in the distance. And this is the central lagoon, beautiful crystal clear water, very tempting to go for a snorkel in here. Because it had been raining quite heavily overnight and in the morning, a lot of the birds were looking a little bedraggled. This is a great frigate bird chick sitting on its nest, such as it is. Fairy terns everywhere, just laying their eggs on branches like this. And this was quite surprising to me to see two nests so close to each other. You can see the two eggs on the same tree there. Again, masked boobies along the shoreline, but just the most insane numbers of mainly Murphy's petrels, all looking very cute. Christmas shearwaters, more Murphy's petrels sitting on rubbish, and nice contrast between the red hermit crabs and the plastic. These hermit crabs were interesting. If you picked up a piece of rubbish, there was often a huge aggregation of hermit crabs underneath, particularly buckets and fish trays and things. Literally, you'd pick up a bucket and it would be absolutely heaving with hermit crabs. And I'm not entirely sure whether that was related to the recent rain or why they had aggregated under these plastic items, but they seem to really find them attractive. One of the more interesting things was seeing the brown noddy nests on the island. The noddies nesting on the ground here, unlike at Tristan where they nest in trees. And their nests were almost exclusively made from plastic. It was just quite depressing to see how much plastic they managed to accumulate into their nests. So as I said, my main reason for going was to look at where all the litter was coming from. So we're doing this sort of forensic assessment of the bottles. So every day I would collect all of the bottles from the island, bring them back to the ship, and then spend the evening going through the bottles. And the other tourists on board thought I was completely mad. But this is quite interesting. We ended up with, this was the sort of top manufacturers of bottles on the island. Number one was Coke, followed by Tingyi Master Kong, which is that blue bottle on the left. We call it our friend because we see it so often. Nongfu Spring is another Chinese water manufacturer. Wahaha is another Chinese drink and water bottler. And then Pepsi, a distant fifth. And interestingly, if we compare that to the situation on Inaccessible Island, the other side of the world, we find pretty much the same ranking. So Coke is number one worldwide. As we know, Coke is one of the major plastic polluters in the world. But after that, it's the same three Chinese companies that come in, whether you're in the South Pacific or the South Atlantic. And if we look at the dates on these bottles, most of them are manufactured within a year or two of the time that we find them on the islands. So it's not as though they've drifted there from China. They've been dumped from vessels. And so one of the things we're trying to do is tighten up the legislation that requires ships not to dump any plastics at sea. One of the other interesting things that you see, particularly for the high density polyethylene bottles, is a really high incidence of fish bites, seemingly shark bites. So that bottle on the right, the black one, is a 2-liter oil bottle. So that's a substantial bottle, and it's a big animal that's taking chunks out of it like that. And those of you who tried to cut into a motor oil bottle will know that it's not a trivial exercise to cut one of those things. And I suspect this is mainly sharks doing this. And we see this pattern in the Indian Ocean as well. A lot of the HDPE bottles that wash up along the coast of Africa, the east coast of Africa from Asia, have been bitten like this. And there's certainly plenty of sharks at Ducie. It's renowned for having one of the highest ratios of sharks to bony fish in the world because it's such a pristine ecosystem. So as you walk along the edge of the central lagoon, there's just these little groups of reef sharks following you along 15, 20 at a time, and they seem to sort of track your motion, which makes you slightly nervous about walking into the water. And so that was Ducie. We only had a day at each of the islands, which was really just enough to really whet one's appetite and want to go back for more. And then it was back to Pitcairn. We had a bit of a surprise in the form of a giant petrel who was way north of where he was supposed to be, came and visited us and scrounged some breakfast bits and pieces. And then it was back onto Pitcairn under much more pleasant climatic conditions, beautiful day and a half we had on the island. We had the traditional Pitcairn lunch where the entire community meets in the central sort of town hall area and brings food and everybody eats communally. Not something you can do under COVID conditions, but I rather suspect that, like Tristan, Pitcairn has closed its borders during the current crisis and will be happily riding out the COVID lockdown in isolation. And then it was back down to the harbour and back onto the longboats and heading out to sea under much easier conditions than when we'd arrived. This was actually the Radio Ham group leaving, but it gives you some idea of what the arrival and departure looks like. So for me, it wasn't a huge number of birds, but the quality was unquestionable. I think I saw about 12 new seabirds, including all of these pterodromas, just amazing. Okay, not all pterodromas, Tahiti's not, but you get the idea. Just to see that many new petrels was amazing. It's a herald petrel. And then it was back to Mangareva and the long flight home. So it's certainly not a place you're going to pop to for on a regular basis. It's about 3 or 4 days solid travel to get there. Even just to get to Tahiti is a couple of days travel. But if you're looking for somewhere to slow down, they're actively looking for immigrants. Pitcairn is on the border of being unviable. With the population so small, they're reaching a point where they just don't have enough active people to operate the basic facilities like operating the boats and so on. So if you're interested in taking a step back from the chaos of Cape Town, you can always go and live in Adamstown and have a view like this. So that's my story for this evening. I hope it's been interesting. Hopefully it's a part of the world that you didn't know that much about, and maybe now you know a little bit more. So that's it from me. Thanks very much. Mike, you